Okay.
Looks like they spelled Brian's name wrong. It says brain fighting.
Well, thank you for that, Michael.
Brain.
I appreciate that. All right. Well, thank you for being here. Thank you for your time, your attention. Today we will be talking to children about substance use disorder while having a substance use disorder. Obviously, there are nuances to that classification, but it'll be presented by me, prevention educator Rita Pino, or patient navigator Brian.
AKA in the house.
So this is technically a parenting presentation, but really it is for anyone that works with kids in any capacity. I just want to reiterate, this is not to scare you. This is to inform you. This is also not a parenting class. You are the best parent for your child. You know them the best. You have been with them the longest, and you've known them longer than they've known themselves. So this is not something where I'm saying you should be doing this as a parent. Also, this is perspective. My approach is shaped by my learning experiences, meaning experiences I come across as a prevention educator, experiences that I come across as a person in general, shaped by the prevention education world. This is also evidence informed and some evidence based, meaning that any evidence I come across, I put it in here. I cite those presentations and those numbers, and you can look at those on your own time to make sure that you have made your own informed decisions on what the evidence presents. This is also evidence-based in that I pull from a lot of evidence-based programs that I do as a prevention educator. So who are we? First up, hello, there's me, Ruth Pino, prevention educator. I am the Mercer County coordinator at the Mercer Council for Drug Abuse and Alcoholism and Drug Addiction. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Global Studies, Political Science, and American Studies. I'm certified in teaching English as a foreign language, life skills training, and leadership. Brian, you're up.
I am the patient navigator for the Mercer Council Alcoholism and Drug Addiction. I currently hold a Bachelor of Science in Psychology. I am almost finished with my master's in addiction studies and mental health counseling. I'm certified peer recovery specialist and certified recovery support practitioner, and I'm also certified in mental health first aid.
Okay, all right, so first up we have Brian presenting the hard realities of substance use disorders.
All right. So we talk about children experiencing substance use disorder, or SUD. The stress and restrictions of the pandemic has caused the lives of individuals challenged with substance use disorder to radically change. Across the nation, steep increases in cocaine use went up 10%, heroin 13%, methamphetamines 20%, and non-prescription fentanyl 32%. Now, this data is from the September 2020 report from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. In New Jersey, the Substance Abuse Monitoring System, New Jersey SAMS, Substance Abuse Overview, provides data on substance abuse treatment in New Jersey for 2019. In 2019, there were 98,628 treatment admissions for the entire state. This data was submitted through New Jersey SAMS by substance abuse treatment providers, specifically kids under the age of 18 that were admitted into treatment in New Jersey, and that number was 1,369, which is 1% of the state. And the number is almost 3 times as greater for 18 to 21-year-olds at 4,002, which is 4%. Mercer County saw 4,265 treatment admissions that same year. Let that sink in for a minute. Out of the state of New Jersey, Mercer County saw 4,265 treatment admissions that year. That's just recorded numbers. That's a lot. As we talk about substance use disorder, I watched firsthand as a parent, my oldest son, who is now 17, he witnessed my substance use disorder. And he was relatively young, and as he was growing older, a substance use disorder impacted him in different ways. Having those conversations with my son now at 17, I understand what life was like for him. But those conversations with him now were not relevant or prevalent then because I didn't know how to address the hard realities of substance use disorder when it concerned him. I thought avoiding him. I thought isolating myself so he wouldn't see. But what I didn't know is he already saw and he already knew because my behavior, my patterns, my attitude, all those things that I didn't say were speaking louder than the words that I could have said to him to explain what was going on. So substance use disorder in the household, in any household, is going to look different.
So Brian, I just want to interject for a second. When we say substance use disorder is something that is particular to a household, I think you can also reiterate that it's particular to a household in culture. Culture looks different in every capacity, but there are definitely overlays in what that means and what that looks like. So thank you for bringing that up as well. Brian?
What experiences can the audience share? Does anyone want to share an experience that either they know someone with an SUD, or we don't have to get personal, but if there is a story or an experience where you've witnessed a child who has gone through experienced an SUD with a parent or a loved one. We want to make this as interactive as possible. Please share if you have an example you want to share or a story.
Yeah, I'll share. I was very young and impressionable, and I have one brother who's 9 years older than me who was involved in substances. And like I said, I was very impressionable. He's my favorite brother. You know, we were inseparable. I tagged along. I was a little brother tailing behind him all my life, still do. And, you know, I picked up on, I think, some of those, like you said, the thinking pattern and the behaviors that he was exhibiting just beyond his drug use. And I mean, he got me high for the first time at 12 years old. And, you know, ever since then, it was on, you know.
Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
The internal factors when it relates to substance use disorder, mental health disorders, and coping skills, the media normalizes this. The narrative existed in the social strata, so children can think that if someone is having a beer, they must be relaxing from stress. We've all seen the commercial where people are on the beach at a remote location and there's a six-pack of Corona with the sweat trickling down the bottle. Right? How refreshing is that? The widespread concern about the potential effects on how the media portrays drinking, alcohol product placements, and advertising, and its impact on young viewers. Can you identify some sources in which young people learn about drugs and alcohol?
Social media, Netflix, all these movies that make drugs look like the best thing since sliced bread.
Okay. Let's expound on that. Social media, movies. As you can see here in the pictures that we have, you know, look at the 2 bottles of Heineken. What's in between the 2 bottles of Heineken?
Spider-Man.
A game controller thing.
A game controller.
I think that's Deadpool.
Oh, that's it. A game, yeah, gaming.
And then you have Mike's Hard Liquor, and there's Deadpool. Right. Michelob Ultra and Lorax. And so our youth are seeing this. They associate with the video game controller. They can identify Lorax, and they clearly know who Deadpool is. But media says that these two are in conjunction with each other. And to enjoy that video game, those Heineken should accompany it, or that Michelob Ultra has relevance to the Lorax movie.
We're sort of, as we're sort of talking about the advertisements and things like that, we can sort of see how they play a role in mental health disorders and coping skills. When it comes to coping skills, I'll be alluding to this on the next slide, so I don't want to get too much into it right now. But coping skills can be anything that helps you relax, helps you cope, helps you escape reality, helps you escape a hard reality. And when you have things like gaming and you have drinks and you have all of these sorts of, implicit advertisements that happen, it can be very difficult to know what a good coping skill is. Mental health disorders also play a role in this. If you happen to be someone who grows up with anxiety, you may think that you are not growing up normally and want to be like other children, which means if you want to be like them, that means you have to drink like them. If you want to be like them, you have to smoke marijuana like them. So there's a play here, a sort of symbiotic relationship between mental health disorders and coping skills, but also the internal and external factors that make a substance use disorder. So we'll also be touching on that too. Brian, with environmental racism.
Yeah, I thought someone wanted to say something.
Oh yeah, do we have anything in the chat? I don't think we do, but.
Okay. I thought someone wanted to say something. All right. All right, so when we talk about the environmental factors, okay, we look at, I grew up in an area where there was a convenience store, a bakery, a mom and pop restaurant, and on that corner was a liquor store. And in the liquor store, they sold lottery tickets, cigarettes, and also, of course, there was also, beer and spirits and packaged goods as well. They actually called the store packaged goods. As we're moving into a new era where these corner store, packaged goods stores, liquor stores are now becoming part of a storefront in a shopping plaza, or they're part of the newly erected buildings that are next to a ShopRite, next to a department store. And these little mini malls now contain liquor stores. They're not called corner stores, they're called liquor stores. And depending on where you live is where you're going to find the different version of a corner store that sells packaged goods or liquor. Those environmental factors are now what our children are seeing, because they're not living in the inner cities, they're now rural, or they're urban, or they're suburban. So their environment is now producing or showing the same as if they were living in an inner city. It's just now in a different area. The same concept, the same external factors are now with them as they are moving from place to place.
Yeah, I think that's really important to reiterate that, it really did start in the inner cities. And now that there's, you sort of have these marketing places, right, with a big alcohol, big tobacco, that are saying, like, this is a community that we can advertise to. And now that they know that they can advertise to other parts of the communities that children reside in, then they have access to those as well, which means they're making more money if they're advertising in inner cities as well as suburban areas. So we have a lot of marketing that happens with that, and they're making a lot of money off of those liquor stores that are present in sorts of that would seem harmless places. So if you want to look at the study that Brian was reading and was referring to, we have two: the NewJersey.gov/Human Services DMHS study. That is a statistical analysis of New Jersey, but we also have the Mercer County study cited right underneath. So we'll be moving on. So this is my slide. Obviously, I had to put a Willy Wonka meme in there because I just feel like it's appropriate. And it says here, "You don't take your own advice. Tell me more about how I should run my life." And meaning that if you are going to have advice, then make sure that you are acting on your own advice, so that you can lead by example. Right here, I had here, taking your own advice, meaning coping skills. Coping skills can be something as simple as going for a walk, counting to 10, talking to a trusted person, or screaming into a pillow. And meaning that if we have coping skills that our children can see that we're using, that we are engaging in, that we are processing with, then they see those coping skills as something that is more likely for them to turn towards. Meaning, I know I have two nieces that I am helping raise, and my coping skill is that I love to paint. I also love to sing and draw, not well by any means, but it is something that I like to do. And they see that, and they also think, well, if I'm stressed or if I'm upset, then that's something that I can do. A daily routine is really important. If we decide to say, all right, if I wake up and drink a cup of water, then my child may do the same. It's more just having the examples for them to understand what their daily routine should look like. And also, if you say, oh, I'm really stressed out, and then you happen to like take out a vaping tool or smoking a cigarette in front of them, and you're like, oh, you know, this is so much better. Like it really does make a difference on how they see stress and how they should cope with it. Also, advice here that Brian had sort of alluded to when we were going over this presentation said, if it feels wrong, it is wrong. And to reiterate that sentiment in your children to say, if this feels like something that's not good for you, then it probably isn't good for you. And I think that humans in general have that gut reaction for when we are interacting with something that could be bad for us. And to just foster that and say, you having that feeling is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. And use that to your advantage. Use it to say that you will be okay and that you can get out of the situation and thrive in a different way. Also for me, my biggest and truest wish is that the children I'm helping raise are acting their age. It's okay to be your age. And I think that is truly important, that if you know your age, if you're 35, act 35. You know, what does a 35-year-old act like? What does a 14-year-old act like? And while 14-year-olds are going through their substance use disorder, remember that children are not adults. And if they are treated like adults, it only adds to their substance use disorder, because they have never had an experience that says, I can get through this. You know, that first time when a child first scrapes their knees and they start crying like the world's going to end, it's because they've never had an experience where they understand that they're going to survive. And it's the same thing with a substance use disorder for the first time. When you have a child that experiences something at a young age that they've never experienced before, it's important to give them the tools and the courtesy to be their age. Clear communication is also really important. What does that look like in your family? There should be expectations for them to understand what they've done wrong, but it can be hard to know when to give them a consequence for their bad decision making, and when to teach them a lesson, and when to sit down with them and just say, hey, what's wrong? So that is up to a parent to decide. That is up for parenting experts to decide. But remember that clear communication should look different in every family, because every family is different. But also know that there should be basic understanding of what clear communication looks like. And that can look like, are there other people in the family for them to talk to? Are there people who have an influence on your child that can be good for them? If you want to talk about a person in your family that is good for your child or has helped you throughout your life, you can put that in the chat and we can talk about that. And once again, are there any people of positive influence? And positive people meaning coaches, teachers, a wholesome relative. It doesn't have to be someone with a title or credentials. It just has to be someone that is there for them, makes them feel valid, and knows when to go to someone else if they can't handle that information. So for example, teachers are obviously reporting people. So if they say something that is of concern, they have to report it to somebody else, but also knowing that when you're an adult and you receive information that is concerning, to put it on to the right authorities so that child can be safe. So yeah, does anybody want to talk about a time when they had a positive person in their family? or in their life in general? It's okay to be shy. So we can move on. It's okay. But just to reiterate that positive influence is really important with children, and that positive influence is important, but also that positive doesn't mean holistically absolutely positive. It means that children are given the balance of what positive means, how to make something out of a bad situation, and how to move forward with coping skills. It's not just saying everything's going to be okay. Yes, Adrienne. Sorry. Yes. I had a raised hand here.
I was just going to say that throughout my active addiction, I think a constant in my children's lives was my mother. Well, actually both my parents, but I remember my mom always reiterating to the girls, you know, Mia's always going to be here for you, no matter if mommy's sick, well, like it. And I think they grew up knowing that if things are bad in the house, no matter what, they could always go to my mom. She wasn't, it was, and I think even eventually at one point in time, my children were removed. And I think that my mom handled it in a positive way, instead of saying like, oh yes, I took, I reported it and I took you from your parents. It was, I did this to help protect you and keep you safe because your parents are sick right now, but your parents still love you. And she really put a twist on it in a positive way. And I think that made them feel safer, and it gave them the comfort in knowing that, she wasn't out to get their parents, and, and she was only looking out for their best interest.
Thank you for sharing, Adrienne. That's really important. That's awesome. Thank you. And a great example, of something that even if it's hard for that person, it's still good for that person, right? So that's a wonderful, shining example of what that can look like. So we will be moving on. Brian, here we go.
How to approach children about their substance use disorder. Discussing the genealogy, is there a gene or history of addiction in the family? Genealogy can play a role in addressing a substance use disorder, but to also know that environment has a role to play as well. We know that mental health disorders can be genetic. How children learn to cope with any stress is environmental. Is substance use disorder inherited or caused by environmental factors? We look at nature versus nurture. The truth is, nature, genes, or nurture, environmental factors, cause addiction vulnerability. Interestingly enough, both can combine to increase the risk of addictions further. Mental health disorders like schizophrenia and major depression are examples of what we're discussing here today. Ruth?
Yeah. So when we are sort of looking at the how to approach children about their substance use disorder, there can be a lot of questions to raise, right? Are you talking to your children? What stage of addiction are they presenting as? So when we are talking about stages of addiction, we are talking about an addiction, meaning substance use disorder. A lot of people use that word just for us to understand the context we're talking about. That is it the experimentation phase? Are they just sort of dabbling, dipping their toes into what that sort of looks like? Are they just saying, well, I'll just smoke a blunt for the first time. Why not? ¿Por qué no? And so you just sort of look at that, and then it moves on after experimentation to regular use and abuse if they decide that they like it. And depending on the mental health disorder and whether or not they have something in their genes that makes them more likely to want it, after one use, they could want to search for it again. It's sometimes for children, if they have it once, that's enough for them, and then they're hooked. So it really does depend on the drug they start with, but it also depends on what is already set in their genes for it to be released. The third stage would be regular use and abuse. And then there's dependence and tolerance, meaning that your body needs it to function. If you have to wake up and smoke marijuana in order to get through the day, that is dependence and tolerance. If you need to smoke more throughout the day, that is dependence and tolerance. And moving on, if you have dependence and tolerance so much, your body needs it, and therefore you happen to be addicted and have developed a substance use disorder. So also understanding what stage of addiction they are presenting means that if you are at the experimentation phase, that looks very different than if their body is completely dependent on the substance they are using. So obviously we have resources for all of those, but more so understanding that stages of addiction present themselves differently, and to understand your child is really important as well. Brian?
And once again, let's ask the question. Is substance use disorder inherited or caused by environmental factors? What are your thoughts? You can respond by coming off mute, or you can put your responses in the chat.
I kind of believe it's definitely, for me, at least I personally, it was a combination of both. You know, there was a predisposition dating back to my grandfather's years. His addiction was gambling. It seemed to have skipped my parents, but there's me, my brother, and my first cousin who were all addicted. And so we must have picked up on certain behaviors and attitudes and reactions and actions of the addict. That would be certainly environmental and biological. So I think it was a little combination of both.
Thank you for sharing, Mr. Russo. You know what? I'd have to agree with you, because I remember growing up, we had a summer home down in Wildwood. And I remember one of my aunts, she would get crabs, and, you know, these live crabs are literally jumping out of the pot trying to obtain freedom. And then once she, you know, got the pot prepared, and, you know, she would pour the Miller or Michelob over the crabs, and then begin to boil, or put them on the stove, and then, you know, begin to boil them. And so just watching as beer was being used in multiple situations for multiple reasons and multiple purposes, then I watched coming up how, you know, every cookout that I was a part of had some type of alcoholic beverage, as if that was the norm, like having water in a cooler. And so those environmental factors, in addition to having that gene or having that exposure to alcohol, led me to my substance use disorder, then to progressively getting to where I became an alcoholic. It wasn't until I discovered that our family had a history, and still does have a history, of alcoholism, that I now can understand that both do play a factor in my life, that both are contributing factors. And once again, it's knowing where it all comes from. Each person is different, each situation is different, and each will have an impact on the individual at a different stage in life.
Yeah, I agree to that, Brian. I also think that they may have children have substance use disorders, but understand and give them the grace that they are trying, and so are you. And that's something to reiterate, that environment may play a huge part, and the nature versus nurture argument will always be there, but understanding that the nurture part of that is intrinsically yours to foster, that part of how you can interact with your children is solely up to you. And Brian, do you want to touch on the last bullet point?
So using language your children are familiar with giving them language to be familiar with. You know, substance use disorder, addiction, overdose. You know, there's stigmatizing words that are common that we hear, and I'm sure the younger generation has heard too, you know, addict, crackhead, junkie. So those, when we use appropriate language, when talking with our children, we want to identify an addict as someone who has substance use disorder, not a junkie or a crackhead. Overdose is not someone who passed out because they consumed too much. We talk about an overdose as having a substance use disorder to the point where they have gone and have done an excessive amount to where they were needed to be revived with naloxone or Narcan. Addiction is where they have that substance use disorder. They're in the addiction phase, the addiction stage of their life. They're not addicts or junkies or crackheads.
Also, to reiterate your point about the word overdose, that overdose really just means going over the dose your doctor recommends. So if you are prescribed one Percocet every 6 hours and you take 2 Percocet every 6 hours, you're overdosing. That's over the dose of what was recommended from your doctor. And for children to understand that overdosing doesn't automatically mean close to death, then you can sort of close the gap on what that gradient looks like, right? So there's a lot of stuff and a lot of nuances to that. But I think sitting down with your children and having those conversations is a truly important part of their development.
Agreed.
We will be moving on to a video on substance use disorder and explaining it to your children. It is a channel on YouTube that I refer to a lot for people that are looking to work with students and don't really know how to sort of open up that conversation. This channel is a great one. I will give their contact information or their YouTube channel underneath the YouTube video that this will be.
What is addiction?
Can everyone hear?
It's also called a substance use disorder. Over 20 million people nationwide suffer from addiction. 1 in 7 people will experience addiction at some point in their life. Scientists first began to understand addiction as a brain disorder back in the 1950s. Doctors Olds and Milner, in laboratory studies of rats, found the parts of the brain affected by addiction. But then in 1994, Doctors Volkoff and Shelbert, top neuroscientists, ran PET scans of the brain that showed the effects of substance use disorders. And like other diseases, these scans showed it affected tissue function. So there are 2 main parts of the brain affected by drug use: the limbic system and the cortex. The limbic system, located deep within the brain, is responsible for our basic survival instincts. So when you do essential things to stay alive, like eat, drink, find shelter, build relationships, or care for your young, your brain reinforces behaviors that cause the release of dopamine from this region. That reward for surviving is also transmitted to the amygdala and hippocampus, which records a memory of that feeling, so we seek it again. This is our survival hardwiring. Addiction also affects this area, up here. That's the prefrontal cortex, which is what separates us from other animals. And this is where decision-making and impulse control live. When drugs or alcohol are used, they activate the very same dopamine process in the survival center. And when use is repeated, that substance can hijack that part of the brain. This hijacker changes the brain and weakens this system to make it believe that the primary need for survival is the drug. In hijacking the brain, it can usurp those primary motivations: food, water, shelter, relationships, and protecting our young. And the hijacker needs more and more of the substance to activate the same level of reward or feeling of pleasure, causing the brain tissue to become increasingly damaged with continued drug use. So why don't all people who use alcohol or drugs become addicted? There are factors that contribute to the development of a substance use disorder. They include individual factors like your genes, your age of exposure, and then environmental factors like drug availability. But there is good news. Addiction is preventable. Key factors that aid in preventing addiction can be categorized into 2 parts: risk factors and protective factors. Protective factors range from parental involvement, programs that improve self-control, limiting availability, and increasing attachment to your community. Another key element in preventing substance use disorders is to delay when use begins. Put simply, prevention is about delaying the onset of first use. In the adolescent brain, where brain tissue is more vulnerable, the hijacker is more prone to weaken the brain and plant itself as a disease. Those with substance use disorders commonly initiate first use much earlier, between 12 and 18 years old, which increases the likelihood of the hijacker taking hold. But if the hijacker does take hold, addiction is treatable. Advancements have been made in assessments, treatment programs, recovery supports, and medications to treat addiction. Brain scans show that once in recovery, the tissue in the limbic system and cortex can get better. With your help, we can expand these innovations to help millions of individuals and families and ensure that addiction is treated as the medical issue that it is.
Okay, so it goes on to talk about their foundation, but I think that is a great visual for children to look at. And I know that it uses big words, but it can at least help us absorb what kind of information that says, and so that we can reiterate that information in a more simplified version to our children. I'll be talking about, what are the signs of substance abuse in children? And really, there are a lot of symptoms, and also some of it ties to just puberty in general. So it's kind of hard to understand what that looks like. So I'll sort of go through the needle in the haystack with you. First of all, substance use disorder is universal, and it does not discriminate based on any trait humans possess. But each stage of life has a developmental difference. Now, human traits, meaning skin color, eye color, it does affect people with certain genes. There are loose arguments for that. But in general, people are just people. And sometimes it can happen to anyone. And I think we realize that. And then when I mean developmental difference, I mean that their bodies are still growing, but more importantly, as it had alluded to, their brains. The brain, the way it develops is it really just starts in the middle, and then it starts to develop from the back all the way to the front. And the front part, that is the last part that is to develop, is the prefrontal cortex, where they make a lot of their decisions. Brains stop growing roughly from mid-20s to maybe 30, depending on what person we're talking about. And most of those happen to be males. Males develop a little bit later, but not by much. And drugs and drug misuse will alter their brains differently than if someone who was 23 had happened to start using drugs. And what it does is it rewrites the neurological synapses your brain has. The more repeated action happens, the more the brain alters to adapt to that chemical makeup. So if you constantly are smoking marijuana from the age of 12 every day, 3 times a day, up until you're 18, that brain and that brain scan would definitely look different than someone who hadn't smoked at all during those formative years. Also, understanding that children have less words and feelings to process their own emotions, so their expressions of substance abuse look different than a fully developed human. Puberty and substance use disorder can sometimes overlap, but what does not change as drastically is your understanding of their behavior. And this, honestly, this is not an exhaustive list. So their interests, their friend group, erratic behavior, sudden physical changes, extremes in sleep. The link between mental health disorders and using drugs as coping skills is obviously there. So if someone has a mental health disorder, it can be helpful to monitor them a little bit more closely to make sure they're not coping in ways that can be harmful to them. Frequent mood swings, changes in sleeping habits, dramatic weight loss or weight gain, declining academic performance, lack of respect for authority or oneself, flushed skin, bloodshot eyes, slow breathing, nosebleeds, unexplained bruises, etc. The list goes on. If you are looking for a more exhaustive list, I have the study and the resources cited right underneath. But it is just to address that signs of substance abuse look and feel, they can be missed if it's not careful. And if we are able to understand our children, able to communicate with them, able to sit down with them every day and be interactive with them, that it is less likely for them to, one, develop something in the first place, but two, for us also to address anything that was there, or it is presently there. And so if you catch them at a developmental stage of addiction in the first or second stage, it is much easier to get them treatment than if they have the third or fourth stage, right? So there are a lot of different aspects to that. Brian, do you want to reiterate anything that I had said so far?
I just want to go ahead and say you've hit on some really great points, and it's what it boils down to is what you see. Have that healthy conversation, because once again, it's what you are observing. You don't want to accuse or be accusatory. Have that healthy conversation and say, listen, is there something that's going on with you that I'm not aware of? I see that, you know, your circle of friends have changed, where you were a social butterfly, so to speak, to now you hardly speak to any of your friends. If your loved one or the child is an athlete, and a lot of during the pandemic, you know, a lot has changed, but if there was Zoom calls or Zoom meetings or, you know, those Google Meet type of meetings where he or she was a part of, but now they're non-existent, it's okay to ask what has happened. You know, there's a lot that we don't know, and by having those healthy conversations, opening it up for discussion, not coming accusatory, but coming as someone who genuinely cares, the responses will come in their time, on their terms, but being consistent, having those healthy conversations will let them know that we actually do care.
Thank you, Brian. That's a good reiteration of the points. I agree. I think also substance use disorder really happens in a lot of high school students. So obviously middle school students have interactions with this, but what we're really seeing is 14 to 18-year-olds are hitting the brunt part of this substance use disorders in children. This study was cited by the Santa Barbara Addiction Center, I believe, or the Santa Barbara Treatment Center in California. So these numbers are a little skewed compared to what the CDC has reported. But essentially what they said was substance use rates among high school students in the US is 70% have used alcohol. Those that have used, 70% of them have used alcohol, 50% have used illegal drugs, 20% recreational and prescription drug use. The CDC reiterates that alcohol, marijuana, and tobacco are substances most commonly used by adolescents. By 12th grade, about 2/3 of students have tried alcohol. About half of 9th through 12th grade students reported ever having used marijuana, and about 4 in 10 9th through 12th graders have reported having tried cigarettes. So I also want to reiterate, prescription drugs, recreational prescription drugs can look like painkillers, opioids in general, depressants, stimulants. But what we're really finding is that ADHD medication plays a huge part in recreational prescription drug use. And we find that a lot in students that want to excel academically or finding pressure from outside forces on performing academically. And we have a lot of pressure with people who have ADHD to provide those pills to those students. So it's not just a one-sided thing. There's a lot of nuances to it, but those are some of the things that occur. Now, some of the common reasons for adolescents to use in general range from general boredom, peer pressure, alleviating social anxiety, a desire for new experiences, improving concentration and boost grades, such as the ADHD medication, controlling weight, poor impulse control, or the need for excitement to escape violence, physical, emotional, or sexual abuse at home, to self-medicate an undiagnosed mental health disorder. So there are a lot of nuances here, and a lot of them present themselves in high school because that's when a lot of the mental health disorders tend to pop up. Brian, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I thought about this as well. What about the child who has the allowance, money, finances? He or she receives birthday money. Those are also some common reasons for adolescents to try substances. They have money, they don't know how or where to spend it. Saving it is totally an opposite thought in their mind. That's not something they want to do. I have money, it's got to burn. It's either burning a hole in my pocket, so I've got to get rid of it. Let me try. Oh, wait a minute. I know a friend that said that they had something. And so that right there could be a common reason, because money and finances at that age is not something that they're thinking about saving for a rainy day, but it's burning a hole in their pocket, so I need to go ahead and spend that now. We can also look at that as a common reason for adolescents to try substance because of finances, money.
And not knowing money management. I think that's a really good point.
That's a good one as well, yes.
Yeah. So yeah, all good points. So this is yours, Brian, take it away.
All right. So how to better protect your children. All members of the family need to be on board and engaged. I want to reiterate that all members of the family need to be on board and engaged. Social media, knowing who and what they're engaged in, communication should be open. I have a 9-year-old and a 17-year-old. In order for me to be where they are, I needed to learn what Fortnite was. I didn't know, I heard of it, I just never knew what it was. So we spend time playing Fortnite on the weekends so I can know what they're engaged in. And through that outlet, I've come to understand and realize that not only can communication be had through a microphone and a set of headphones, but also there's a chat feature as well. And if you're not paying attention, messages are being filtered through that chat feature. And so once again, trying to better protect my child or children in general, I need to know where they are as far as what they're viewing, what they're playing, what they're hearing, what they're seeing. We also talk about TikTok. TikTok is a great way to express yourself, but there's messages behind the message. Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Twitter, Snapchat. I learned something recently, and I shared this with Ruth. If you've heard of what's called the WhatsApp, and she identified with me, and it's used to communicate to a loved one or a friend overseas. It's primarily used is for speaking or communicating in a foreign country when data rates wouldn't apply if you were to use your mobile device where data rates would apply, or you'd have to subscribe to a international call plan. So WhatsApp is great for every reason you could think of, but once again, it's inclusive of everyone. No one is excluded from using it. So if your child or a loved one has a mobile device, they're able to download the WhatsApp. They're communicating with whoever they can speak to with a number, whether it be US based and or across seas. That does not have a filter. It's easily stored under another app. You can disguise it, you can hide it, where you are thinking that they're texting a friend through your data plan, where you might be able to monitor through a family share and or parental app. But at the end of the day, that WhatsApp is literally allowing them to communicate with whomever, and it's not traceable unless you can physically see the app, because there's an option there to delete or hide messages. So to better protect children is understanding and knowing what they're doing and where they're doing it at. What we don't see is the greater concern, in my opinion, to what we do see. And so having those healthy conversations allows us to understand where our children are and how to better protect them.
Great points, Brian. Also, I have done a lot of webinars on peer pressure and social media. So if you have any concerns about social media, subtle advertising, things like that, myself and Amy Argirio, who is the life skills grant person at Mercer Council, we have done a lot of research on this. Myself and Melissa Arnold, who is the prevention specialist at Mercer Council, have also done a lot on this. So if you're looking for more information on this particular slide, there are so many resources for you. We have a bunch listed in our YouTube description, so you can just sift through and see what you think is applicable. So yeah, thank you, Brian. Anything else to add?
So here's the thing, is there any of these examples here that the audience would like to add to? YT stands for YouTube. I didn't go ahead and address that, but YT is YouTube. Is there any others that could be applicable to this list here? This is just a short list, and there's many others. Just, getting that conversation started is where a lot of conversations are had during these type of either outlets and or applications either by phone, tablet. So if anybody would like to add to the chat or come off mute and share.
Okay, well, just to add to that a little bit, that community sharing is really important. Having a community is great, but you also have things like Minecraft that's not on there as well. So just making sure that whatever games they're playing, Roblox also. So just keeping track of the communities that they're a part of could really be helpful in understanding where any sort of mood swings or any sort of weird behavior could be coming from. So we'll be moving on. And we are running a little low on time, but I think we're going to make it. So we are sort of wrapping up our presentation on saying leading by example and what to do in case you are a little bit worried about what that means. First of all, prevention education is the best tool to start. And the best tool to not start. So making sure that they have as much prevention education as possible to understand what to do, what not to do, and how to interact with their internal and external triggers, which Brian will be touching upon.
When we identify internal or external triggers, when it comes to substance use disorders, people, places, and things, we identify as external triggers. Internal triggers, how I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, those are personalized for me. Today started out as a good day. I got some bad news. And all of a sudden, my mind has turned from enjoying what today started out to be to I'm worrying, I'm concerned, I'm nervous, I'm anxious. Those internal triggers could then lead to using a substance. And if these are continuous over a period of time as a repeated behavior, I associate my anxiety with smoking a cigarette. I identify my depression with drinking alcohol. Those external factors, people, places, and things, be mindful of who they're hanging out with, who they're talking to. Repeated behavior can lead to substance use disorders.
Also having someone who is an advocate in and for recovery. This is something that Brian wanted to put in there. And I think we should reiterate that having someone who knows what to do, who is involved in the resources and the capacity of knowing how to approach a substance use disorder is extremely important if you see that is really good for your child, which I think it is. So.
You want to show that you are in recovery and actively seeking it every day. So what does that look like? That's attending therapy, whether it's group or individual. Meetings, 12-step meetings, all recovery meetings. You have a sponsor or you're looking to gain a sponsor. That's someone who is an advocate in and for recovery. They have been where you are. Look at them as a mentor if need be. They're going to guide you to another day of sobriety. Recovery network. People who are working a plan of recovery daily and or are advocates for recovery. I always used to say, and I still say it to this day, I want what the person in recovery who has 20 years, I want what they have. I want to know how they've made it to the 20-year mark. They're celebrating 20 years. How did you get here? Because no 2 days are the same, but the substance is. The results of using the substance is. And so each day, trying to obtain another day of sobriety, having a strong recovery network is only going to aid in that walk on a daily basis.
Also, I sort of just want to put it in there as another thing that if there is bitterness about not being helped sooner or your child having it better than you, there's still healing that needs to take place. So if there is any sort of negative feelings that you have associated with your own recovery, don't project that onto your child's recovery. Their recovery is different than yours, and it is going to look different than yours because they are younger and they're going through different things. So just a reminder as that.
We want to be there for them when they're ready to talk. Active listening. We want to remind them it's not their fault. You want to look beyond a child's behavior, ask why. Help kids to learn to deal with the emotions in a healthy way. Most importantly, let kids be kids. Encourage their silliness.
Thank you. And also, you know, let them know that there are consequences for every decision, but display that and reinforce that while you're doing it. And last thing, after every presentation, I always do quotes, just so that they are food for thoughts. I have here too. My child has no idea how hard it is for me to constantly wage war against an invisible enemy, a disease, and what feels like a war against him. He has no idea the toll it takes, hating the consumer and loving the sun. That is by Sandy Swenson. She has a wonderful book. My son, and I also have another quote, my son is not a marionette I can control with words or wishful thinking. My actions are not his actions. My pulling the strings isn't the same thing as him doing the work. What I've done is give the consumer wearing my son's face a stage for going through the motions. What I need to do is clip the strings. So those are all closing thoughts. And once again, that is an excerpt from the Joey Song by Sandy Swenson. It is a wonderful book and I highly recommend. So thank you for being here. Thank you for what you do.
This was great. Thank you.
Time. And if you are wondering about any resources that we have next week, tune in. So thank you.